Hello, and welcome to the CoStar News Hotels podcast. I'm Natalie Harms, a reporter for CoStar News, and today I'm joined by Michael Chang, Head of Sustainability and Resilience at Host Hotels and Resorts. Michael, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on. Really happy to be here.
Well, I know I don't have to tell you this, but we are in the middle of hurricane season, and it really kind of begins its peak every year mid-August. So as we speak, the first named Atlantic hurricane of the season, Hurricane Erin, is churning, and it's expected to kind of bring some rough conditions to the East Coast. We have no clue what the next week holds, but when we're talking right now, that's what's going on. But I'm sure you're keeping a close eye on that storm and other storms. Am I right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, from a hotel perspective, there's of course nothing you can do to prevent a storm or its damage, but you can prepare, right? So there are a couple of ways to do that, from design elements to operational strategies, kind of on the ground floor of a hotel. But let's talk a little bit about kind of host perspective today. I think it's also a little bit I don't know if ironic is the right word, but, the high risk destinations are also the kind of high sought after hotel destinations. So that means, kind of beaches and tropical escapes. So it's a bit of a gamble. So tell me a little bit about kind of how Host organizes its portfolio and kind of mitigates that risk, manages that gamble.
Sure. Owning these hotels in highly desirable but climate vulnerable destinations really requires a sophisticated and nuanced approach to risk management. At Host, we don't view these locations as liabilities, but as strategic assets requiring diligent, forward-looking stewardship. One of the key steps in doing that is having is doing a comprehensive climate risk screening and assessment. We leverage third-party climate analytics combined with our proprietary business intelligence to estimate exposure to hazards like storm surge, flood risk, wind events, and like hurricanes, and increasingly wildfire and power disruptions. So for example, prior to acquisitions or major capital projects, we assess location-specific risks using modeling to forecast these potential impacts to really understand how those impacts can affect our business and ensure that they inform our investment decisions.
Mhm. I think it's interesting. How did you get into this business? I'm just curious.
It goes way back. I
Mhm.
began my career in China in high-tech manufacturing, manufacturing computer chips. And while I was there, I helped them spin off a side business using lower quality raw material to manufacture solar panels. This got me interested in clean technology, went back to school, thought I was going to work in big oil, did a 180, and ended up in carbon, looking to work in carbon projects. Um, which led me to consulting and now at Host. I've been with Host for about 11 years now, and really helped build the program to where it is today across all environmental, social issues and helping to integrate that into the business.
Yeah, because not only do you focus on resiliency, you're also focused on sustainability. So they do kind of go hand in hand, of course. So there's that. And thanks for that background. What about from hosts' experience background? Because I know some of the recent storms, hurricanes Helene and Milton,
Yep.
did affect host properties. So how did you navigate that recovery on those properties that were hit?
So resilience has always been a priority area for Host. From a kind of qualitative perspective, we've understood the risks, and for that reason, we have a very geographically diverse portfolio within the U.S., where not more than roughly 10% of our EBITDA comes from a specific market. Um, and throughout since 2016, we've invested over 300 million in projects that increase the resilience of our hotels. This could be, hurricane rated windows and doors, facade enhancements, relocating critical infrastructure, I believe 6% of our CapEx on an annual basis is dedicated to these types of investments. So what we've done, more kind of recently is put more structure around how we understand climate risk and how that impacts our business. Prior to Hurricane Ian, Helene, and Milton, we began this process of screening our portfolio of these risks to understand, where are we exposed to the highest risks? And obviously, that's oftentimes our beachfront properties in Florida and the Gulf Coast, in Hawaii, in California, and also in Houston. We have quite a few hotels there, where you're based. So it's more of a kind of an organic growth, as we continue to build and progress, on how we invest in our hotels to be more programmatic about it, to have this comprehensive view. So while we're doing a major renovation, we also have this understanding and this knowledge in mind so that we can add to the resilience of the properties.
Mhm. Yeah, so what talk me through some of the kind of going through that, you're setting these right pieces in place for a bigger picture resiliency plan, and then you kind of get back to back hit by storms. What goes into that, like kind of phase one of recovery, while also still the ongoing bigger picture resiliency plan?
I would say that phase one of recovery is kind of the emergency aspects, right?
Hmm.
Restoring power to the property, making sure that all of the critical infrastructure is still operating and that it's safe to return to the hotel property. There is a preparedness plan that we require each of our properties to have that is kind of unique to the kind of risks that that property has in those certain locations. On an annual basis, we hold a webinar with all of the executives of the hotel to make sure they understand our expectations on what these preparedness plans should have, as well as communicate to them the resources that we can provide, on these recovery efforts. Their companies, and how to make insurance claims and things like that. So there is a aspect of training, for the
Hmm.
hotel staff, as well as resources that, as the owner, that we could provide to help them return to business.
And then, of course, a later stage, I don't know if it's the next stage, is renovation and getting the property kind of back together, and that varies, of course, in terms of how much work has to be done. I want to zoom in and talk specifically about the Don Cesar in St. Pete Beach, Florida, which was one I guess the biggest hit from those recent storms, and it did take a while to get it back up. So what all kind of went into that recovery process?
Sure. I would actually like to take you a little bit further back to Hurricane Ian.
Okay.
That was probably our largest insurance claim at the Ritz-Carlton Naples, which currently actually serves as a benchmark for success in our resiliency investments. Following Hurricane Ian, the hotel property closed for 9 months,
Mhm.
for extensive rehabilitation, including floodproofing, dry floodproofing, elevating mechanical systems, and installing modular flood panels. Because of these investments, when Milton and Helene came, which brought similar storm surges, similar impacts, it caused minimal damage to the hotel property. Floodwaters only penetrated roughly maybe 2 to 4 inches inside, and there were no insurance claims filed due to the damage because it was below our deductibles. The hotel reopened in just 9 days after those storms versus 9 months after Hurricane Ian. With the Don, we understood the risks of the Don Cesar, it being, a 100-year-old hotel. A lot of its critical systems were below grade in the basement. So when the storm surge from Helene came, it basically wiped out all of the critical infrastructure in the hotel property. That is the main reason why the property was shut down for 6 months. We had to kind of rebuild all of that critical infrastructure. But not only that, because of its historic nature, we had to be very kind of careful to to respect that historic status. The restoration was a bit more sensitive while embedding resiliency upgrades and balancing that preservation with durability. At the Dawn, as part of our strategy, we implemented similar investments as we did at Naples by elevating all of the critical MEP equipment, some to the second floor even. We built new structures, installed new flood barrier systems, elevated the generator, elevated the fire pump, really to move all of that critical infrastructure above a certain flood level. We also enhanced the roof and deck pavers so that they're hurricane rated. And this was in addition to investments that we already made from 2017 through 2020 around the facade enhancements. Those investments actually helped protect
Mhm.
the guest rooms and other areas quite well through these two events. But because the critical infrastructure was knocked out, that's why the hotel was offline for such a long time.
At least from these 2 hotel perspectives, that kind of the storm, resulted in now, future resiliency, and it kind of allowed for, yes, it was closed for months, each of them were closed for months, but, now in the future, they won't be, like the Naples hotel, is
Right.
an example of that. So that is interesting. I wonder, outside of major storms kind of prompting these big renovations, what are some of the design decisions that host has to make in some of the existing properties that haven't yet been hit by a storm, but you're hoping, these kind of changes and making these decisions will help for more resiliency in the future?
It's not necessarily design, but one of the kind of strategies that we're moving forward with that we've implemented or are implementing this year is modular flood barriers at our highest risk locations. Through our climate risk screening and kind of on-site analysis, we identified 24 properties that have high exposure to flood and wind risk, representing like a third of our EBITDA. So we picked 9 of those top properties, performed on-site visits with a team of architectural and structural engineers, and really identified all of the vulnerabilities at those properties when it comes to flood and wind risk. We found that modular flood barriers is probably the most cost-effective solution in kind of mitigating all of the 100-year flood risk that remains at these existing properties. Since they were built 20, 30, 100 years ago, the 100-year flood line has kind of evolved. We found that there were kind of areas where water can come into the building and potentially knock out critical systems. At these 9 properties, we have modular flood barriers or backup measures in place. And a critical aspect with using these systems is making sure that the hotel staff are trained to deploy them at the right places. At the Dawn, 100-year structure, there is multiple vulnerabilities all around the properties. So it's critical that the hotel team understand where those are and the different types of barriers that should be in place in advance of a certain event.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I wonder, are there any other kind of infrastructure for resilience elements that, you're either implementing now or have already implemented, or maybe even kind of that are on the horizon of being trending within the space?
I'll talk about a little bit about our process, right? We talked a
Mhm.
little bit about business continuity and recovery, proactive mitigation of near-term catastrophic risk. Some of the opportunities that we identify, we're putting it into an end-of-life replacement bucket, right? We're integrating it into our long-term capital planning because we're kind of balancing that risk, the chance of a certain event happening, while taking into account the cost of implementation and the level of effort. Elevating critical MEP systems, that is very disruptive to hotel operations. You have to bring in kind of temporary power, just the construction. At Ritz Naples, we built an external structure and raised everything above the second floor and third floors. So, these types of investments, we're waiting until the end of life so that we can make those improvements and do a more comprehensive construction while we're renovating or doing some of these investment strategies to mitigate, maybe a 500-year flood risk, and kind of reduces the vulnerability to lower probability of these high impact events. Some things that we're looking at in the next phase is power resiliency. Um, Bringing power back to the hotel quickly is critical. And in some of these recent events, it would knock out power for days, for weeks. Where we have, golf courses, if the irrigation system isn't running because the generator is only sized for, fire life safety systems, we may lose that entire golf course. And the rehabilitation of that would be very cost intensive. We found that, to maintain that golf course, there were staff hand watering, but that would only kind of be a stopgap measure for a few days before there would be real damage to those courses. So we're looking at expanding our power generators and also looking at modular systems. For example, in Florida, where we own multiple properties, we could potentially store power generators offsite and deploy them to different properties as needed in certain events.
So, one thing I appreciate just listening to you kind of go through all of this is the kind of juggling act that it is of kind of finding these, long, big picture, long term, making these changes in that way, but also, you know, keeping in mind that these storms hit when they hit, and that can really mess up your plan or kind of escalate too in some cases. I wonder, how do you communicate this in other ways, from maybe from an insurance perspective, from your shareholders perspective? How are you communicating this message on what you're doing, and maybe quantifying it?
Yeah, definitely. Because of the impact of these recent events, hurricane events, it's really been top of mind for our
Mhm.
investors and insurers, and they're really looking to us to tell them, what is our approach in mitigating these risks? Does Host continue to be a good investment? Why are these property? Why should they continue to insure these properties? Right? What we've been doing is we've been working with our insurance broker who has a lot of the COPE data on our properties to understand the risk from a holistic perspective, before mitigation measures and then after mitigation measures. Across the 9 properties I just talked about, we identified 100-year flood risk. Because of these flood barriers, what are we kind of increasing or mitigating that risk to, right? Are we mitigating up to 500-year or 200-year? So our insurance broker is able to help us quantify that impact, and that translates directly to lowering our annual average losses. And this messaging has been received very positively from the investors, from our insurers. I think this transparency allows them to really understand, what risk are inherent in investing in these properties and what we're doing to mitigate them, as well as what is the return on our investment of those investments that we're making.
Mhm. Yeah, all so important and key in the whole process. I wonder if we can kind of shift gears a little bit, because I want to talk a little bit about kind of sustainability. I definitely mentioned earlier they do run hand in hand, resiliency and sustainability. But I wonder if on the sustainability side, could you talk a little bit about what's trending for hotels in that space, and kind of what you're seeing, what Host is focused on for ensuring sustainability?
Host, we've had our sustainability program for over a decade. We've set our first sustainability goals in 2012, and we're kind of in our fourth iteration of those goals. We do have aspirations to drive towards net zero operations by 2040 and going beyond that by 2050, in kind of pursuing this net positive operation. I would say that we take the same approach to both transition and physical risks, and this is kind of centered around the concept of responsible investment throughout our portfolio. We don't make investments that don't have a good return on investment. So we always consider the business impact as well as the environmental and social. And you can see in our kind of CR reports that we publish on an annual basis, we're very transparent about the amount of investment that we make into sustainability, the returns that we expect, which is in the mid to high teens. On the climate risk side, when we're talking about the physical risks, we're seeing returns 10x of every dollar invested to increase the resiliency of the property because we've had to close properties at Naples, at the Don Cesar, and has experienced the impact of these events at other properties as well. We're able to really calculate the return on investment from the dollars that we put into resilience by keeping those properties open, right? But not only are we kind of safeguarding, protecting our assets, we're also providing a social good to the community. If we're able to keep the properties open, we often house first responders. We house folks in the community that are impacted and really kind of try to be a good steward of the asset as well as the community so that we can help community recover from these types of events.
Yeah, I think it's a great point too that when you're thinking of sustainability, people assume it's not the cheaper option usually, but there are instances where the ROI is there to make those decisions. And whether it's kind of sustainability and resiliency, has that kind of evolved over the years, do you think? Now we're getting to a point where sustainability decisions are good business decisions.
Well, they've always been good business decisions for us. I think, over the years, we've made investments in, like LED lighting, smart energy, in-room energy management systems, smart irrigation systems that track weather patterns, advanced building management systems. We have a very strong track record of making successful investments in these types of technologies in our properties so that our operators can, manage our properties more efficiently. On average, over the past 5 years, we've invested or we've completed over 700 sustainability projects, and we expect a total aggregate annual return of 23 million in utility savings. This really helps to build the case as we continue to make these types of investments. We also have sustainable financing to support the acceleration of kind of these concepts into our business. We have 5 billion in sustainable financing through green bonds and a sustainable link credit facility. So resilience projects is one of the eligible project types where we can allocate these monies to these types of projects. This helps lower our cost of capital. So not only are we seeing an ROI at the properties, we're also seeing ROI at the corporate level because it lowers the cost of our money.
Well, I think this has been such a great conversation. And to wrap up, if you could kind of maybe give some advice for other hoteliers in the space, because, climate disasters are not going away. In fact, they are increasing. It's got to become more and more important to, hotel owners and even operators in some cases to implement a lot of what you've been talking about today. So, just what comes to mind as being, top tier advice for approaching resiliency in hotels?
I think it's critical to embed climate risk into business decisions. An anecdotal example, after Naples, we invested a lot into making the property more resilient. I won't name the resort, but there was a resort nearby who built back and didn't include those resilience investments. When Helene and Milton came around, that hotel property was severely impacted again in the same way, while we were able to quickly reopen. So it's really critical to have resilience planning to safeguard assets and operations, and our leadership and kind of this diligent strategic investment really drives value, reduces long-term risk, and sustains building business continuity in the face of increasingly frequent climate hazards.
That's such a great point. Everybody kind of has to, from a leadership perspective, everyone has to be on board and see the importance of those decisions. You can't just be making those decisions on your own with the whole host team, right?
Right.
I don't think that would go over well. But
Yeah.
that's great to know. And like I said, this has been such an enlightening conversation. I know, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we are in peak hurricane season, so only time will tell what kind of happens from this season and future years as well. So really great to have that kind of future mindset and think about these things. So thank you for joining me, Michael.
And thank you, Natalie.
Hi, I'm Davon Reed.
I'm Omari Head.
And I'm Chris Henry.
We're the hosts of the Next Gen in Lodging podcast. It's a monthly show in which we interview a new generation of hoteliers to get their insights into a variety of disciplines and topics, from finance to food and beverage and hotel operations. Listen to us on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode of the CoStar News Hotels podcast was recorded on August 20th, 2025 by Natalie Harms and edited by Rachel Dahm. Look for this and more at costar.com/hotelnews